Do I have?
Welcome to this IChemie Safety Centre webinar. Who is running your plant at 3 a.m? My name is Trish Kerrin and I'm the Director of the IChemie Safety Centre. Joining me today, I have John Bresland, a former Chair of the US Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board. The purpose of this webinar will consist of John presenting his research on control room operator competency. This IChemie Safety Centre webinar has been developed as a tool to share knowledge and information. During this webinar, you'll be able to ask us questions by typing them into the questions panel on your screen. And at the end of the presentation, we will get round to answering those questions from John. You can also use the chat box if you want to interact with other participants in the session as well. So I will now hand over to John and he can then start his presentation. Welcome, John.
Okay, good morning. Let me just do one thing on my computer here.
Okay, no problems.
Are you seeing my presentation okay?
Not yet, no, it hasn't come up.
Show your screen, okay. Click show my screen.
Yep.
It's there?
I'm still not actually seeing your presentation.
What?
Sorry, while we just sort out this technical detail, we will be back with you shortly. Yes, okay, now we have your screen up, John, so you're ready to go. Welcome to the webinar.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Trish, for that invitation. As you said, my name is John Bresland. I am talking to you from Shepherdstown, West Virginia. And it is 7 a.m. in the morning here in West Virginia. And I know some of you are in different parts of the world. And for those of you who don't know where Shepherdstown is, which is probably 99% of you, we live about 70 miles west of Washington, D.C. And my background is 35 years in the chemical industry, 10 years at the Chemical Safety Board, of which 5 years were as the chairman of the Chemical Safety Board. And then the last 3 or 4 years, I've been doing some consulting work in the chemical and oil industry. And even more recently, for the last 4 years, something completely unrelated to what I was doing before. I am chairman of the Board of Health here in our local county, which is, we oversee the health department, which deals with issues of restaurant safety, deals with drinking water, and deals with getting ready for any medical emergencies that might happen. But that's not what you've got on the webinar to hear today. So I'm going to click on my first slide, and you'll see it's entitled Warren Buffett. And for those of you who don't know Mr. Buffett, he is one of the most successful investors in the world. He's the CEO of Berkshire Hathaway. And for those of you who may have been fortunate enough to invest $500 with Mr. Buffett in 1964, that would be worth $12 million today. So he really has been very, very successful. He buys other companies, so he is a risk taker, but he's not a gambler. He does know what he's doing. And one of my favorite comments from him is, risk comes from not knowing what you're doing. And the same risk applies to a chemical plant as to financial investments. You need to know what you're doing. That means having the best educated chemists, chemical engineers, mechanical engineers, as well as process operators and mechanics. Now, we all know that The professionals are educated and hired. They all have bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, PhDs. But what about the process operators? And that's going to be the topic of my talk today. And in a way, it's going to be a sales pitch to those of you who may be operations managers or those of you who may be human resources executives. It's a way to try to persuade people that the most important people in your plant are those who are there at 3 o'clock in the morning with nobody else around. This is a photograph, and I call it my moment of truth. And this is a photograph of a chemical plant that I worked in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the USA. And you could see it's not in very good shape when the photograph was taken. And so this is how I became to be a believer in the need for well-educated and trained process operators. In this plant explosion, which is the plant where I was working, and very fortunately for me, I was not there that day. I was at a meeting out of town. The console operator, or what I would refer to as the board operator, was new in the job. A process tank overheated. He didn't notice the fact that it was overheating. The material inside decomposed. The tank exploded. There was huge amount of damage. There was community fear. There was outrage. And since then, I've become to believe passionately in the need for well-educated and trained process operators. So my purpose today is to tell you how this has been done around the world. So the question is, who's running your plant at 3 a.m.? And in my presentation, I'm going to use the generic term process technician. So the question is, how do you hire your process technicians? And historically, they've been hired off the street and then trained. And when I say off the street, I don't mean that literally. What I do mean is that they've been hired maybe from another industry, and basically with no knowledge of how a chemical plant works. And then they have to go through on-the-job training. And over the years, the oil and chemical industries continue to become more technically complex with more and more sophisticated equipment, especially sophisticated electronic equipment. And so new thinking is needed about operator hiring practices. You don't want them to be trained on the job. You want them to be trained before you hire them so they can walk right into the job and with a minimum amount of training be able to take over and start doing that job properly. So why do you need well-educated process technicians? Well, there are a bunch of reasons. Obviously, employee safety, because those are the people who are in the first line of being potentially exposed to a hazard or a dangerous situation. You have community safety. I don't know if any of you were watching the news from Houston over the last couple of weeks. There were two major process industry fires, lots of black smoke floating over Houston, and certainly a lot of very negative reporting in the newspapers about the industry. And I know the Chemical Safety Board has gone to investigate at least one of those incidents. So you need well-educated process technicians to ensure that your community is safe and they're not going to be rising up against you. Obviously, protection of the environment. You don't want to be spewing out dangerous chemicals, smoke, black smoke into the environment. Your company reputation can be ruined by one fire. You may have taken weeks, years to build up that reputation, and all of a sudden one incident can ruin it for you. And obviously, operation continuity. The best way to run a chemical plant is to have it run day in, day out, and shut it down at your decision point for appropriate maintenance, not to have it shutting down accidentally. So you want operators who know how to operate the plant and keep it running day in, day out. And all of that leads to financial success. So the process technicians are the front line of your operations. They're there at 3 a.m. when you are in bed. They're running the plant, and they have the total responsibility for the safe operation of the plant at 3 a.m. So what are some of these new current issues for process technicians? There are a number of them, and they all seem to be, some of them are old issues, and some of them are completely new. And let me give you just a few examples. Cybersecurity is obviously a concern for those of you who are working in the process area. We keep reading stories about cyber attacks, and I don't know if there's been a successful cyber attack on a chemical plant, and if there had been, I would guess that the company would probably keep it fairly quiet. They don't want to be spreading the bad news so that other people might decide to take advantage of that situation. The public has an expectation for your safe operations. In general, the public has very low tolerance for chemical fires and explosions, probably zero tolerance. They usually get, these incidents usually get front page coverage in newspapers and on TV, and especially today on social media. And on social media, a bad incident can be reported to 1 million people in a flash of a second. So it's something that you really have to be concerned about. In today's chemical plants and oil refineries, there are all sorts of advanced control systems that your process technicians have to understand and be able to operate successfully. The new issue that seems to be in the news all the time today is artificial intelligence. And my guess is that this is being used in oil refineries and chemical plants in today's world, but probably even more so as as the whole system of 4G turns into 5G on our computers, and it's much easier to install artificial intelligence systems. Again, these are complex systems that your process technicians have to understand. Process simulators, these are excellent tools for training, and they're being used in most of the very sophisticated operations that the chemical industry is running. And finally, the new word is blockchain technology. Some of you may understand what blockchain technology is. I've been reading about it, don't entirely understand it, but it's something that your operators are going to have to understand as time goes on. So this goes back to November of 2017. Ian Travers and I wrote an article for the Chemical Engineer, which is the magazine of the Institution of Chemical Engineers in the UK, which is sponsoring this webinar. And between the two of us, we wrote this article, and we decided to do some research on how process technicians are educated and trained around the world. And coming out of that research was the article that we wrote. And as you can see, it was published in November of 2017. It's a pretty straightforward description of the different programs available for training process technicians. And mainly our focus was on two-year technical college. And again, as I say, my presentation today is more of a sales pitch for those programs, knowing that they definitely will improve your safety and reliability of your operations. If you want to read the article, this is where you can connect to it. And Trish, who introduced me, if you actually want to, rather than writing all that down, I'm sure Trish can email it to you. It's even though I say it myself, it's a pretty good article, so it's worth reading. So, how long does it take to train someone to work in a sophisticated industry? Airline pilot, 18 to 24 months full time, and that's probably after they actually know how to fly a plane. But this is to learn how to actually operate, one of the more sophisticated large jets in today's world. And unfortunately, we're reading about the tragedies that come from some of the issues with airlines over the last few months. Nuclear power plant operator, very comprehensive program, and I'm sure it's the same around the world. Very comprehensive program followed by a government licensing exam. I know it's a government licensing exam in the United States, and I assume it's the same in other parts of the world. A process technician, or a PTEC, as you may see it shortened in my presentation. Let me go back one step. To be fully trained as a process technology technician, it can take 6 to 8 years, and that's from the time when they walk in, in today's world, walk in off the street, and they start going through the progression of an outside operator to eventually become a board operator or a console operator. That can take 6 to 8 years, and that's an expensive process, but it's a very important exercise. It would be valuable to you to be able to shorten that time. Can the time be shortened? So let's talk about some of the hiring processes that I've been experiencing in the United States. And obviously it varies from company to company. You would have hiring off the street followed by training. And as I said, I don't really mean hiring off the street, going out and picking somebody from the street, but hiring from another industry, hiring someone who's relatively new and has worked in a different type of industry, and you're hiring him to come in to work in this complex process industry. In the US, there's certainly hiring preference that's given to people with military experience, and this has been very successful because of the greater level of maturity. Somebody who's been in the military for 5 years, been in the Air Force, Navy, Army for 5 years, they've learned to have a greater level of maturity and discipline found for those who have that military experience. Then you have a 2-year process technology college education, and that's what I'm going to be talking about as we go through this presentation. Sometimes you may hire someone with a bachelor's degree in chemistry or in engineering. Somewhat unusual. Usually they're hired to have the professional expertise as opposed to going to work right in the operation. However, in a way, my bias is, and it doesn't happen very often, my bias is if you hire someone like that, the best sort of training experience that they can get in the early parts of their career is to actually go and work in the chemical plant as an operator or as a board operator. It's a terrific experience building because you're learning the issues of dealing with people, you're learning the process inside out, and you're learning what the real world is like, dealing with, as is the case in many facilities, dealing with trade unions. Obviously, if you hire somebody with a bachelor's degree in chemistry and engineering and they go to work in the operation itself, they don't want to spend all of their career on a rotating shift. So they'll probably do that job for several years and then move into one of the more professional sides of the business. But again, as I say, there's There's no experience like it. Process technology training in the United States. Well, there are three ways to do it, three main ways to get involved with a 2-year process technology training. And I'm going to talk a little more about them. First one is what's called the North American Process Technology Alliance, also known as NAPTA. And there's their webpage. Highly recommend that you get on their webpage, naptaonline.org. I don't mean you do it right now, but when you get off. The second one is an organization called petrochemicalworks.com. And then there are several independent colleges and universities. So between these three, these are the organizations that have a 2-year training program for the process technology operations. So let's talk about NAPTA. And this is a quote from the person who is the director of NAPTA. Through collaboration among industry, educational institutions, government, and others, NAPTA will support the development of a diverse, qualified process technology talent pool to meet workforce needs in North America. And they're, as we say, they're an alliance, and they're made up of 46 community and technical college members. And if you get on their website, you'll be able to list all of those technical college and community members. They have 8 dual enrollment high school members. These are high schools. High schools in the United States are what we call the school, the final school before you leave and go off to a university or go off to start a job. They have 8 high schools that also do process technology training, so that someone can walk out of a high school and be somewhat ready to go straight into work in the industry. They have 21 refining and chemical industry members, and again, they're listed on their website. And they have 16 learning resource members. A learning resource member would be an organization that puts together some of the types of resources that are needed. For example, standard examination, the types of texts that are used for the training, workbooks that are used for the training. Now, some examples of the industry members, and again, you can see these on the website. We had a BASF, SABIC, INEOS, Dow, Shell, Valero, Total, Dairy Farmers of America, Eastman Chemical. So a lot of high-level, well-respected organizations are using the NAPTA training program to hire people who have gone through the 2-year course. So as Eric Newby would say, he's the president of NAPTA. This is an interesting observation. We don't teach them how to run a plant. We teach them how plants run. So if you're being trained at a 2-year college, you're not being trained on how to operate a particular type of process, like a phenol process or an oil refinery process. You're being trained in a more general way on how the whole technique of chemical plant oil refiner operations, how pumps run, how distillations columns operate, how distributive control systems operate. And just looking at some of the sorts of training that they get in these colleges, it could include process equipment, process instrumentation, process quality, process operations, safety, health, and the environment, troubleshooting, etc., etc. And The interesting point about the education is research has shown that 1 year of process technology education is worth 5.3 years of job experience. And this is where it's extremely valuable, and this is where if you're a human resources person or an operations manager, that your ears should pick up, because you're hiring somebody who has gone through this training, and rather than train them for 5.3 years on how to do their operations and how to run their facilities, they already have that 1 year of PTEC training, and they can step right in and become much quicker on the job to be fully qualified. Again, some of the instructions that they're getting would be material handling, extraction, distillation, evaporation, heat transfer, reaction processes, chemical and fire safety, codes and standards, and just general plant operations. Very excellent use of 2 years if you're 18, 19 years old. It's a really well worth. When I talk to people we live in a small university town, and we're very close to a lot of the university students, and they're coming out of university, unfortunately, with some money owed, some debts because of their training, and they're out searching for a job. And I will tell them it's probably too late, because they've already gone through their 4-year college education. But a really good, if you're not interested in the college education, a really good way to make good money immediately is to go through this training and then go into work in the industry. This is a photograph from a BASF facility of students who are going through the training, and part of that training would be working. Part of that training at the 2-year college would be doing some on-the-job training at a facility, and in this case, it's at a BASF facility. One company that has really taken this on is SABIC North America, and in discussions with them, they talk about the challenge that they have faced over the years. SABIC some years ago bought GE, General Electric plastic operations in the United States, and they went through rapid plant expansions and hiring in the 80s. And in the 80s, when you think about it now, that was 30 years ago. Those people who joined 30 years ago are starting to retire and have been retiring over the last 5 to 10 years, and those retirements are going to continue for the next 5 years. So there is, because people are retiring and leaving, there is an ongoing need for well-trained recruits. And so SABIC has endorsed the NAPTA curriculum, and they're working with NAPTA certified colleges in the areas around their chemical plant operations, and they're using those colleges to recruit new process technicians. And they're encouraging non-NAPTA community colleges to adopt the curriculum. So there may be a college in their area that is not part of the NAPTA alliance, but what SABIC is doing is encourage them to look at the NAPTA, at the curriculum, and using that curriculum to train people who are then hired by SABIC. And their ambition, before they were using this process, again, as I said before, it's taking 3 to 6 years to become board or console capable, which is the ultimate goal of someone who goes to work as an operator in the chemical plant. And today the goal is down to 12 to 18 months to be board capable. That's a significant reduction in the amount of training and a significant cost reduction for companies. A lot of reduced need for on-the-job training, and you can walk into a job, excellent pay, and even more important in today's world, excellent job security. and you're going to be making almost immediately $70,000 plus. So why wouldn't you do it? The second, leading NAPTA, the second organization that's involved in this training of process operators is an organization called Petrochem Works, and its name is www.petrochem.works.com. It's mainly located in the Houston, Texas area, and students there can use this website, and it's a very, very sophisticated website, and I highly recommend that you go and look at it. They've done a superb job of putting this website together. So students can do several things. They can research employment opportunities. They can determine which companies are hiring, and they can do research to find out where to go to get PTech training. So if they're looking for a job, they can find out where the companies are. If they're looking for education, they can find out where the training is. And again, if you go to Houston and drive around, you'll see billboards that say you can make $70,000 a year or more by going through this training and getting into the industry. It's supported by JP Morgan Chase, the banking company, a $5 million grant over 5 years. I don't know if those 5 years are up now, but it certainly was a very, very significant and worthwhile, and they should be well supported. And I think my thinking is that their rationale with this in the Gulf Coast area of the United States was, if you have well-trained people, good companies to work for, they will be supporting the local community and paying money, and it's definitely it's a good way to just develop overall the economy of local communities. So with this website, you can do three things. You can put in your skills. What is your skill set? And then based on that skill set, they will send you in a particular direction as to what that skill set would be valuable for. It's also, you can put in your interests. What sort of job would you like to have? And you put in your education, and then add those three together. You can come up with the perfect job for yourself, and again, move in quickly and start making $70,000 a year, which is a very attractive salary in the United States for somebody who's probably going to be in their early 20s, or perhaps coming out of another industry where they're not making nearly as much money. The third way that I've talked about, I've already talked about NAPTA, and I've talked about Petrochem Works. The third way is there are some universities that are independent, and they've decided to have these programs because around them there are industries that are looking for companies, are looking for process operators, and those process operators, because they're not part of the NAPTA organization or they're not close to the Gulf Coast, they don't have the opportunity to get trained. So, and a good example of that is Montana State University. The state of Montana is out in the northwest part of the United States, and in the Billings area, or in Montana, there are several large companies several large processing companies, chemical companies, and they are looking for good people. And so Montana State University on their own has set up a process technology training program, and I'm just looking at some of the courses, the required courses during this 2-year program. Some examples would be, and it's interesting, the first two they list are communications in a dynamic workplace and introduction to public speaking. Then they've got fundamentals of process technology. They've got process diagrams for process technology, process plant safety, boilers, accessories, and basic operations, hazardous materials, technician, general training. And those are 5 or 6 of probably 20 or 30 courses that they would have to, that the student would have to take over that 3-year course or 2-year course. It's interesting to look at the photograph and see the safety equipment. You can see earmuffs, you can see eye protection, you can see headgear. And in this case, I think in the photograph, they're doing something that has to do with taking agricultural products and turning them into, or what's left over from agricultural products and turning them into useful useful material that can be sold. But again, they're in their lab training and they're wearing all the appropriate safety equipment at the same time. So how does it work in other countries? Well, I'm going to quickly go down the list of the companies that we talk about in the paper that we wrote back in 2017. I'm going to talk about a few of these countries. I've listed India, South Africa, United Kingdom, Germany, Australia, Singapore. We don't have time today to talk about them all, but I would certainly recommend that you go to the article. There's a lot more detail about each of these countries, but I have picked a few to talk about. One of my favorites, I don't know if we have anybody calling in from Singapore, but certainly training practices in Singapore, which has one of the largest petrochemical and refining complexes in the world. I spent some time there a couple of years ago, was very impressed. So coming out of high school or secondary school in Singapore, you'll get a secondary school certificate. Then you'll go to a technical institute, and the one that's most well known in Singapore is the Singapore Institute of Technical Education. And it's probably the best program that we studied during our review for the paper. So you have a 2-year program there. 6 months of those 2 years is spent as an intern in a refinery or a chemical plant. Then you go back and finish your 2 years. Then for males, this is where it's completely different. For males, excuse me, I'm just taking a sip of my coffee. For males, they are required to spend 2 years in public service. Now, what do I mean? What do they mean by public service? That could be working as an EMT, an emergency medical technician. Could be working in the fire department. Various public service. Could be part of their military operations. So they have their 2-year associate degree. Then they go into 2 years in public service. And finally, they get a job in a chemical plant or in an oil refinery. And as I said, the Singapore Institute of Technical Education, also called the College East, is probably the best program that we've studied. And there's a very strong cooperation between industry and the training colleges in Singapore. If you want to see a brief video that Shell and the Institute for Technical Education in Singapore put together, it's on YouTube, and this is where you can see it. But it's actually pretty easy to find on YouTube. If you just go onto YouTube and search for Shell training, it'll come up. And it's a 2 or 3 minute video. I was going to show it on this, but it didn't work out too well in terms of being able to see it. It's much easier to watch it directly on YouTube. Can't show it here, but it's certainly worth watching, and I would definitely recommend that you check it out. In India, it's not uncommon, and we didn't have the opportunity to talk directly to a company in India about the benefits of PTEC training. But apparently it's not uncommon for a board operator, a console operator, to actually have a bachelor's degree in chemistry or chemical engineering working in a facility in India. You can get a 2-year, alternatively, you can get a 2-year diploma with industry experience. And there are 2 ways to do it. You have what are called industrial training institutes, of which there are, believe it or not, 2,200 in India. And these are private organizations. And then they also have what are called industrial training centers. And again, there are 9,700 of those. And India has a population of more than 1 billion, and it's got a rising middle class. So it's not really surprising that there is a need for skilled workers, and hence the huge number of training institutes. And not only do they train for chemical process technicians, if you look at their website, you'll see that they have training for about 130 different types of trades. The sort of trades that we would think of would be, people who are electrical skills or plumbing skills. They have all of those, as well as the process technology training. So there's a very sophisticated setup in India for the process technology training. In the United Kingdom, the training isn't mandatory. It's basically outcome based, and it's on the onus is on the Seveso site operator to make sure that the people who are working are sufficiently competent, and at all times you have the right people working in the plant. So it's really outcome based as opposed to let's start and train people. So if somebody comes into one of your facilities in the UK and they're going to check and see if the people are appropriately trained. Obviously, for a bachelor's degree or a postgraduate master's degree in chemical engineering, those jobs or those trainings are for the technical managers. And you also have Cogent skills for process safety management training. Cogent is an organization that's owned by the trade associations in the UK, those trade associations who are associated with the science-based industries. And then finally, you have something called the Health and Safety Executive NEBOSH Certificate in Process Safety Management. NEBOSH standing for National Examination Board on Occupational Safety and Health. So it's different from the 2-year training program that we've been talking about. But this is the way that it's done in the UK. So getting close to the end here, again, getting back into my sales pitch. Why do we have PTEC training? Well, coming out of the training, you'll have a more mature employee. And as I said before, you're going to save a lot of time in on-the-job training. 1 year of PTEC education is worth 5.3 years of job experience. And if you read the article, you'll find the reference to the research that was done to come up with this statistic of 5.3 years of job experience. And one interesting thought today is that if you go to a 2-year college, a lot of 2-year colleges now already have control systems installed, the distributed control systems installed that to train the student on how to use the control system. And if you're lucky, that student would have been trained on that particular training control system in the one that's used in your facility, so they could walk right in and be able to use it. And then with your higher salaries, not all that many people are paying $70,000 a year to young people recently out of school, and you can pick the best students and get the best employees. And you could be hiring, as was the case that we mentioned with SAVIC, there's a current bubble of people who are leaving, retiring, and you need to hire people quickly and hire the best people quickly without going through 5 or 6 years of on-the-job training. So a photograph of these are getting back to NAPTA, the National Alliance of National North American Process Technology Alliance. They have skills, troubleshooting skills competition every year, and these are the 8 finalist teams that this troubleshooting contest was held, and each year it's held at one of the NAPTA member colleges, and you can see they're all ready to get off there and be given a troubleshooting exercise and figure out what went wrong. So thank you for your attention, and certainly I'll be happy to answer any questions or comments that you may have.
Thanks for that, John. I think there was some really interesting aspects of the different ways that operators or process technicians are trained around the world, and it certainly makes you wonder whether we could be getting a lot better outcomes in our industries if we could come up with a consistent way collectively around the world to do it perhaps as well. I've got a question here. Are you aware of whether there's been any formal control room operator behaviour and modification programs? So I'm interpreting that as actually being around how do we look at changing the behaviour modification, similar to some of the behaviour-based safety programs where you've got safety observation type activities. Do you have any comments on what you've seen in that space?
No, I haven't seen any, and I'm not aware of any training that would be heading in that direction where when you're working specifically with control room operators. I think the trend in today's world with control rooms is to move them away from the actual specific. Well, let me go step back a second. If you take let's say a large oil refinery, it may have 10 or 15 different process units, and each one of those process units historically has its own control room. In the modern way of doing it, they take all of those control rooms and consolidate them into one central control room, which is situated away from the process operations. So certainly one thing that's missing from that is the sort of face-to-face interaction between the control room operators and the field operators. So there has to be special attention given to how does that communication take place. And in the ones that I've seen, it takes place as a large TV or a large video console where they're able to interact face-to-face, but it would be a human face to the video face. So they're training, that sort of training of the different types of interaction between the control room operators and the field operators is certainly very important.
Okay. Do you think that the PTEC training works better when it's chartered by the government, like in Singapore, rather than by the private industry or universities, which is more the US model that you spoke about?
Oh, Singapore is, if you've ever been to Singapore, and I'm a big, I loved my time in Singapore, even though they're pretty strict about the way things, Singapore's got a pretty strict way of doing things, and people obey those rules. And you're not allowed, obviously, you're not allowed chewing gum in Singapore. You get on the subway, you're not allowed to take any water with you, and people obey those rules. So people in Singapore, there is I think that people expect pretty strict government control. In the United States, it's more it's more, let's not have government control over this. So I don't think there's I think it would be difficult to take the Singapore model and put it into effect in the United States or in other countries. I think the model that they have in the United States of the alliance between industry and the training organizations, the universities, works very well. And if you get, I know they got excellent communications, good conferences that they hold every year to talk about their issues and talk about their problems. So I don't think that the Singapore model, although it works extremely well in Singapore, I don't think it's one that's easily transferable to other parts of the world.
Yeah, I think that probably makes sense. It really is more around that whole issue of the societal culture as well that it fits into. So I think you probably it's a good representation there. What are the essentials that you think a control room operator must have?
Having spent a lot of time in control rooms, historically, I'd say going back 20, 30 years, it always seemed to me that control room operators back then didn't really know what they don't know, and the training for them wasn't as good as it should have been. So I think a good control room operator who's sitting in front of a console and he's looking at a valve and he's moving that valve, he needs to have in his mind's eye where that valve is and what's it doing. And that comes from having worked. You don't become a control room operator straight away. Obviously, you don't walk in and say, well, I'm going to become a control room operator. You have to go through the outside process, learn the process on the outside, so that when you move inside and you're making these adjustments, you know where that equipment is and what's happening to it. So you have to have that outside experience as well as the sort of more detailed experience of knowing just how the control system works, knowing how the advanced controls are working, knowing how whatever artificial intelligence is working. So you have to have that combination of the outside experience and the inside experience.
Okay, thank you. During the student internships that you spoke of, do the interns perform some of the actual work as long as it's under direct supervision?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I would think probably not. Certainly not without direct supervision. I don't think you'd want someone who's just come out of let's say they worked their first year at the 2-year college, and then they go and do as in Singapore case, go and do a 6 months worth of internship. I think it would be much more appropriate that they would be working under the direct supervision of someone. Now, after maybe after a few months and they're working on a particular job, they certainly could be sent out to get samples or move valves. But I think you have to be very cautious with that you can't expect them to take on that responsibility right away. I don't think it would be fair to them.
Okay, no, that sounds reasonable. I've got quite a long question here. It gives a bit of background. So it's from someone that's based in the UK at a storage terminal for jet fuel. They've taken on 22 operators in one go due to an expanded operation. We created a structured training approach as we were employing staff off the street. Now we're finding that due to shift plans, it can be hard to maintain people's competencies. In some tasks which are less frequent, as some of these tasks on their shifts, others may not come across until 3 years after their initial training. Do you have any thoughts around that sort of, maintaining the competency of something that is so rare that you may go years without seeing that particular task?
That's an interesting question, because it does come up when I'm talking to people that in today's world, in the chemical industry, and probably even more so in the refining industry. You may go for several years between what I used to call turnarounds or shutdowns, where you shut down everything for uh, you know, maybe 3 or 4 weeks and do all of the maintenance work, maybe do some of the capital installment work that you weren't able to do because you were running the operation. So then, what do you do about your those those types of things that you only come across every 2 or 3 years? That
Mm.
uh, you need to sit down and think what those are, because when you're shutting down, and I'm using shutdowns as an example, you're getting into a different situation, and typically a potentially more hazardous situation. I I when I was watching the fire I'm not sort of getting off the track here, but when I was watching the fire in the last couple of days in Paris, and they were saying that it was probably caused during renovation, and then I think about an oil refinery or a chemical plant being shut down. People are doing jobs that they don't normally do, and you've got people coming in from the outside um, to, who you don't normally hire, and you have to put them through training. You have to be very, very careful in those times that that something bad doesn't happen. But I think the question is more related to day in, day out. You're doing routine activities, and you're supplying fuel to I'm guessing maybe to an airport, and then every 3 years there's something different happening. I think that requires good communication and just good training to tell people this is something different that's happening today, and we need to sit down and spend some time thinking about it, and what's the right way to do it. I don't think there's any magic bullet to that issue, apart from just having good pre-training and pre-discussion of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. One of the ways I have seen some of that dealt with is when you've got the procedure that even though you're not going through that task yourself, there's a set refresher period where, as a shift team, you actually work through what the procedure would look like and what you would do to at least just kind of practice what's going on. I have seen that done in that particular instance. I've still got a couple more questions, and we're actually running out of time. There's been a lot of questions come through on this. You talked about workforce retiring. What do you think can be done to retain some of the troubleshooting ability, since the new workers do not see as many process upsets? We're now seeing more stable operations, obviously.
Well, I think what happens sometimes is that a worker retires, and the company realizes, well, he's taking away a lot of 30 years worth of skills. Why don't we hire him back as a contractor or a consultant, and let help him do some of the training? That's that's one way to do it. How do you retain the skills? It's a difficult problem, because if you've worked in a chemical plant for 30 years, you have this skill that may not be written down in an operating manual anywhere, but this is the way we do it. I'm not saying it's not, let's not get involved in this is the faster but unsafe way to do it, but this is the right way to do it. And they walk away, and they've taken those skills with them. It's maybe if somebody decides they're going to retire in the year before they finally leave, you have them spend some time doing some extra training of the new hires. But it's certainly an issue that people need to think about, what's the best way to handle that, and it's probably pretty much on a company by company basis and a facility by facility basis as to what do we do. You don't want to be losing 20 or 30 of your best people all of a sudden, and you're left with 20 or 30 relatively new people running, taking their place, who don't necessarily know how to deal with some of those unusual issues that only come up every 5 or 6 months.
Yeah.
I think the important thing here is to think about it and think about what do we need to do as an individual company or an individual facility to work through that issue.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I've got one last question here that I'll just try and squeeze in quickly. It's a comment about going to conferences like the Global Congress on Process Safety, which is held in the US every year. Don't see a lot of talk about operators. I see a lot of talk about operators, yet I don't see many operators in attendance. Would it be beneficial to encourage more operator participation in process safety conferences? What do you think about that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that entirely. It's a little, it's a little, there's probably some resistance to that because you send somebody off who's working shift and you have to find somebody to work overtime to take their place. But if you pick the right conference, and it's not one of the real academic conferences, but one of the more practical conferences, and send them off and let them sit through the presentations, let them meet people, talk to people. I think it's very, very valuable for them to do that, and they come back maybe with a whole new perspective on the way things are. And it also gives them, if they want to move up to become supervisors, shift foremen, supervisors, it's a good opportunity for them to sort of just add to their level of expertise.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. And I've also got some feedback that it was a great presentation, really enjoyed the dialogue, and hopefully there will be more. So people obviously want you to come back again, John. I'd just like to thank you again for your participation in the audience, in sending in lots of great questions and listening to the presentation. John, a very special thank you to you for your commitment to the work that we're doing in the IQME Safety Centre. This is the second webinar you've done for us, and by the feedback, maybe there might be some more into the future. If anybody has any particular topics they would like us to cover in future webinars, please email us at safetycentre@iqme.org. This webinar has been recorded and it will be uploaded onto the IQME Safety Centre website, and it will be available freely for anybody to view into the future. Thank you very much for your time, and I wish you all a very safe day.